Thank you very much. Good to be with you again this afternoon. Does archaeology confirm the Gospels? There are matters relating to archaeology. There are general landmarks, such as Nazareth. Already mentioned that briefly. I'll add just a little bit to what I said yesterday. Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem, for example. But here's one of the questions, too. It's back to one of these minimalist things. That's the second bullet. Did synagogues exist in the time of Jesus? Some have actually raised a question about that. Said, the Gospels are anachronistic, talking about synagogue buildings that would be known as dedicated buildings for gathering of Jewish people for worship, that actually is post-70, after the temple's destroyed. Oh, really? And so the Gospels are anachronistic in that they're reading into the beginning of the first century an architectural reality of the end of the first century, not the beginning. And of course, the third bullet, have we found the tomb of Jesus and his family, as Simcha Jakubowicz suggested 7 or 8 years ago? So we'll look at Taipiot in perspective. All of this very quickly, as well as just a point or two relating to some new and exciting information relating to crucifixion nails, which I know sounds kind of creepy. Was there a Nazareth? I touched on that briefly yesterday. Well, was there a Nazareth? Well, what's the evidence for it other than 2,000 years of continuous habitation? Overlooking that for a moment, we have the priestly courses inscription. I showed you the fragment on the left. There are actually 3 of them. They're called A, B, and C, these 3 fragments. And the fragment on the left would read, the 18th course is Hapizes of Nazareth. There's the actual name Nazareth written right there. Okay? Now here's what it would look like in the full text. And so the piece that I pointed to that says Nazareth is right there. And so we have the A, B, and C fragments and what the whole thing would have looked like. It's based on, as you can see over here, it's based on 1 Chronicles 24, 7 to 18, where all 24 courses of the priests are listed, and those who take turns in serving in Jerusalem. Now what happened was the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And so the priesthood attempted to remain intact, functional. There was the hope on into the 2nd century that the temple would be rebuilt. And so the argument here is, why would a Jewish inscription refer to a non-existent village that perhaps Christians invented to give Jesus of Nazareth, who didn't exist either, a place to grow up? See how silly that minimalist thing is. And so this is Jewish archaeology. This is a Jewish text. It's nothing to do with Christians. It's nothing to do with Jesus. And of course there is a Nazareth. One of the priestly divisions was located there. The Gospels also tell us about a pool of Siloam, John's Gospel in particular, where Jesus healed a man, and we weren't real sure where it was. Now, the pool on the left has been the popular identification. It is fed by the Siloam spring, but it's actually only a few years ago, 10 years ago now, that the correct identification was made, not the Byzantine era pool, but the pool of the 1st century, the very place where Jesus met the man who needed healing. And so you can see the excavations underway. I have visited this pool 2 or 3 times since it was discovered. In fact, I know the archaeologist, Ronnie Reich, who was involved in its excavation. So these are the kinds of things that give us confidence in the Gospels. They talk about real places that we actually can find. And given time, who knows what the percentage could be. I mean, I think it's not likely we'll find 100% of every single thing the Gospels talk about, but the percentage keeps growing as archaeology continues. Serious Archaeology, responsible, properly done archaeology, is only about 100 years old. You need to understand archaeology is not well represented by an otherwise very entertaining Indiana Jones. That's just smash and grab. I tell you, that would be fun, because if you do the real archaeology, it's a bit tedious. It's an inch at a time, but you don't go busting into an ancient temple, dodging poison darts, and then you grab something made out of gold and you run off and hope nobody gets killed. That's not what we really do. It's an inch at a time. Now, what about this idea that there really were no synagogue buildings? A prominent New Testament scholar 20 years ago claimed that not only Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts were anachronistic, but so was, in fact, Josephus, a younger contemporary of Jesus and the disciples. He, too, talked about synagogues as buildings. The argument was the Gospels, the book of Acts, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, were all reading back post-70 realities into the pre-70 world of Jesus and his disciples. So was he correct? He claimed there were no synagogue buildings. He claimed there really isn't any evidence of such. Well, here are summaries from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you get the impression from these summaries that Jesus is in the synagogue all the time. So this is a serious matter. If the Gospels are so anachronistic as to read a half-century change into the beginning of the first century, suggesting that Jesus routinely taught in synagogues, and by the way, sometimes healed people in the synagogues, and there weren't any synagogues, that would be a problem. So that's why this is such an important issue. Well, let's talk to the archaeologists. Are there any pre-70 AD synagogues? Yes, they will tell you 8 and counting that have been identified. And there's the list right there. The one that's doubtful is at the very bottom, and that's Shuafat. Some are doubtful about Capernaum only because it's been built over. There's a 4th century beautiful limestone synagogue built on top of the original foundation. That's the way it was when excavation first got underway and the debris was cleared. That's what it looks like now, partially restored. That's the floor plan sanctuary, so to speak, on the left. Community center, fellowship hall on the right. This is why I think it really is on the site of the original synagogue. Look at the foundation. What you will look at as you go from left to right, the first tier of limestone, which is obviously different from the dark-colored volcanic basalt, gets thicker and thicker as you move left to right. Why is that? The foundation is not level. Now, you don't have to be an engineer, an architect to know you never build on a terribly unlevel foundation. In fact, when you get all the way to the right to the end, the first tier of limestone is almost a meter thick, starting from mere inches, expanding as it goes to the right, so thick. That's how off the foundation is. In fact, notice how the foundation begins to bulge out. So the foundation isn't even square. Now, why would a beautiful limestone, which in today's terms would be a multi-million-dollar building, built on such a shabby, unlevel, out-of-square foundation? It is because that's the Jewish custom. You hear it echoed in Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 when he says you should be careful how you build on the foundation. You build on the sacred foundation. So even though this foundation, because of an earthquake, we think, had become out of square and no longer level, it was still a precious spot they wanted to build on. So it's very likely built on the foundation of the synagogue in which Jesus was present. We think that the limestone 4th century synagogue would have looked like that. Now, this is important evidence. Here's Gamla, for example, destroyed by the Romans, clearly pre-70, destroyed in the year 67. Josephus actually gives us an account. There it is. And by the way, if we walk to the other end of this synagogue and look that way, You see a small building that's covered with the roof. Beneath it is the mikvah, that is where you are ritually baptized, immersed. And most synagogues have these mikvaot attached to them or are very close by. There is its own schematic. Here is the Herodium that was built by Herod on top of a hill, a fortress. And inside the fortress, when the rebels captured it during the Great Revolt, 66 to 70, they converted the dining room that's in the center there. They converted a dining room into a synagogue, following the same kind of sacred space schematic of the bench seating along the walls and the pillars inside, and people sit not like you facing the front, but rather on the outside walls looking in. Here's a synagogue that was found just 5 years ago at Magdala. That is, Magdala, the place where Mary Magdalene was from. And you can see the interior pillars and also this interesting stone. There you can see the stone in the center of the picture. It's an ornate stone. You see the menorah and so forth. And this, of course, these symbols represent the temple. When the rebels captured Masada during the revolt, they converted a room in Herod's fortress palace. They converted it into a synagogue. And again, you see the seating on the sides. There it is, another picture. And of course, these completely unnecessary, just ornamental interior pillars. Why? Because that's the way a synagogue is supposed to look. We have found a pre-70 synagogue at Modin, and Modin is the place where the great Maccabean freedom fighters, that was their hometown. Here is Kiryat Sefer. Here is also a very important inscription found in the rubble at Jerusalem, rubble from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and that inscription thanks Theodotus and his family for donating money for the building of the guest house and some other features for the synagogue there in Jerusalem. And you'll notice references to a father and a grandfather, and if this inscription is pre-70 and it refers back that far, it's likely the synagogue was built at the turn of the era. In other words, at least 50 years old or older when it was destroyed by the Romans. The epigraphy, the style of Greek, clearly is Herodian from the time of Herod the Great or his sons, and the location of it suggests that it has to be from prior to 70. We even have an inscription referring to the repair of a synagogue, and you don't repair groups of people, which is what synagogue can also mean, a group of people, but you repair buildings where groups of people congregate. And here, this one actually has a date on it that is the date of the 3rd of December of the year 55, and it was found in North Africa. The evidence is simply overwhelming that there were indeed buildings recognized as synagogues in the time of Jesus. Now, what about the Taipiot Tomb? That's the way it looked when it was inadvertently discovered and the earth was cleared away in March of 1980. The door is missing, but what you notice is this pointed gable with a circle beneath it, and the pointed gable and circle right above the entrance. A schematic bird's eye view looking down, so you have burial niches inside, 6 altogether. But it was this ossuary, and I know it's hard to read the Hebrew on the right, but you can see at the right edge the X, and then the Hebrew begins and moves from the right to the left. Here it is a little easier to see. It's Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. Simcha suggested, there he is, after an unauthorized entry, down, it's now underground, down into it. He is caressing this pointed gable, in his Discovery Channel presentation that aired in February of 2007, and he said this pointed gable and circle represents the Jesus movement. It's a secret crypto Jewish Christian sign. Really? And James Cameron, who helped him produce it, you know James Cameron, his credentials are unimpeccable in biblical studies. I'm kidding. He did RoboCop and Titanic. should be given an honorary degree. Anyway, he explained that he took 3 years and spent $3 million to understand the meaning of that gable. And I thought, what? And I watched the documentary, ran upstairs, and this is in my library, pictures I found in 30 minutes, and it explained that the pointed gable and circle actually alludes to, well, what do you think? Look at the coin in the center, the temple. It has nothing to do with the Jesus movement, and it was a theme that was popular in burial ossuaries and tombs, and you can see again the pointed gable in a variety of ways with the circle beneath. And by the way, in this one you see the X twice. What does the X mean? Is it a cross tilted over? No, it's an X. And the X means this end of the lid goes with this end of the box. He also made a big deal out of DNA. You remember that? He said, ooh, the DNA is very significant. The Jesus box DNA and the Mary box DNA shows no relationship. Well, there's only one conclusion you can come to, and that's they must have been married, right? Oh, brother. In any case, that was his argument. But what he forgot to mention in doing his DNA analysis is that he had paid to have DNA samples taken from Nazareth and the nearby village Turia, and those are bone samples from Turia, to see if there was a Galilean regional DNA signature in the bones found and the trace remains of DNA found in Taipiot in Jerusalem. Well, there wasn't. And so his DNA studies actually refuted his hypothesis that the Taipiot Tomb is related to Jesus and his family. But somehow that just got cut out of the documentary and isn't in the documentary or in the book. That was something that Greg Monette and I and some others discovered a year and a half ago during our tour and work in Israel. That's actually one of the Turia tombs where some of these samples were taken. And then I conclude in reference to new evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. In a popular book 20 years ago, John Dominic Crossan said the evidence is so slim that Jesus would have been buried because crucifixion people just weren't buried. Now that is wrong on many points, and I don't have time to go into it. But he refers to, in this quotation on page 188 in his book, Who Killed Jesus, there's only one nail and one skeleton. Actually, that's not true. There are 138 nails, many of them with calcium traces. And here, of course, is that famous right heel of Yehohanan, and the crucifixion nail is still in his heel. The point is crucified people were taken down from the crosses and were properly buried during peacetime. When Jesus was crucified by Pilate, that was peacetime, he almost certainly would have been properly buried. And that's an example of what a crucifixion nail looks, and that's the bone box in which the skeletal remains of Yehohanan, whose heel you just saw, that's where he was placed. And so when the spike went into his heel, it fish-hooked, as you can see in that picture. They were unable to extract it. And so I had the opportunity, Greg and I, to meet with this Dr. Israel Hushkovitz at Sackler Medical Center in Tel Aviv University. He's Jewish, he's not Christian, and he shed a lot of important light. We asked him, do you think Jesus would have been taken down from the cross and was properly buried? He said, well, of course. Okay, so let's be settled on that. Was there a tomb where Jesus' body was placed? Was there an empty tomb for his disciples to find Sunday morning? Indeed, there was. And by the way, I'm crawling out of the tomb where a man with leprosy was buried, and we don't have time now, but the point of this is this has confirmed that people in the time of Jesus did, in fact, have leprosy. And of course, if you want these PowerPoints and the other ones from yesterday, as well as 15 others and some videos, they're available on flash drives at the book table. Thank you very much.